I just want an excuse to film an entire video in some extra AF makeup? No, but also yes. Hi, I'm Sen, and today I'm going to be dissecting my entire AP art portfolio. There's two different AP art exams. There's 2D, and then there's drawing/painting, and I did the drawing painting one. So for AP art, they make you select a theme, and you kind of devote all your pieces throughout the school year towards developing and investigating this theme, which is why it's called a sustained investigation. Now, I'm not very good at drawing people or buildings or anything else, so I chose to make my sustained investigation based on plants. College Board makes you fill out like an overall guiding question for your investigation, and mine was basically, what are our relationships with plants? Which I understand is a very, very vague topic, but I did get a 5. So, you know, College Board? Let's just get into reviewing the portfolio before this devolves any further. So here is my first piece. Wait. I didn't have any black paper to do this on, but I really wanted it to be on a black background, so I just took like a normal white piece of paper, painted it black with acrylic paint. I probably did like 2 or 3 layers, and then I used white pencil to draw this skull on top, and then I just kind of like outlined where I wanted the rays to be, and then cut out a bunch of collage stuff and glued it in. My second image was a thing from my sketchbook. It was just showing how the different colored pencils look on tan versus white paper, showing how you can layer different colored pencils and like blend them together. Or like if you press down too hard on the paper, then it grinds down the tooth of the paper, so it's like not got that nice texture anymore, it makes it like real smooth. And I didn't like the way coffee looked because it kind of stained the paper like into a beige color, but it was like a cool toned beige and there were like coffee grounds left over. I didn't like that at all. So tea staining was the method I chose for this next piece. And then I wanted to see if it was better to wrinkle the paper after staining or before staining. And pretty clearly, there's a lot more like cool texture to it if you wrinkle it before you stain it. I just wanted to show College Board how I think in terms of developing a piece, all the different techniques or media I might use, from the color of the paper I used, the types of pencils, how I use the pencils, the investigation of tea versus coffee, and the wrinkling before and after gives a lot of insight into how I, approach my art process. So here's the actual piece that I created using that information from the last, sketchbook investigation. These little tabs are actually glued on. They're like the wrinkled tea-stained paper that I cut into little strips, and I wrote the scientific names of all these different plants. And it was just kind of a commentary on how humans feel really big, but ultimately they're kind of small compared to all the other wildlife going on in the scenario. They're small in the grand scheme of things, And actually that was the similar theme that I was going for with this guy. Humans in the grand scheme of things are nothing compared to plants in terms of biodiversity and how long we've been on this planet. Even if humans died due to self-imposed climate change, plants would still exist and thrive without us. So that was kind of a more biological exploration into our relationship with plants. The fourth image is a painting. This looks a lot bigger on screen than it actually felt. I just wanted to represent how peony petals are really beautiful and they're my favorite flower, and climate change is destroying the things we love. And then I brought this to my art teacher and she was like, oh, you could also BS something about how flower petals are super delicate, so Earth's ecosystems are super fragile. And I was like, oh, you're onto something. The next thing I submitted was another sketchbook page that kind of explored what I wanted the composition of my next piece to be like, and I compared color pencil versus watercolor, and then kind of did color pencil on top of watercolor to see how I liked that. So I ended up doing that piece over there. I first did a base coat of watercolor, and then I layered a lot of colored pencil on top, and at the very end I glued some dried rose petals just on top of the piece. So I emphasized in my description how flowers are kind of this thing of beauty and elegance, and we see them quite often in magazines or media as a symbol of beauty. And so I really wanted to capture that feeling of editorial photography, when you open up a really cool fashion and style magazine and you're like, they had hair and makeup for this, they had stylists for this, this is really cool, that feeling. I wanted this piece to kind of evoke that, and I emphasized how I made it wider than it is tall to capture that feeling. This was a revisionist piece that I did a little bit later in the year, and then I just included it as slide 7 because it was based on image 6, the one up there. I took a close-up of the left eye over here, I zoomed in, I made the photo super saturated so I could see all the different colors going on, and then I just like did blobs inspired by those colors. And this was something our art teacher actually recommended to us, is when you don't have like time for another full piece, look at one of your past pieces and like zoom in on it, or do something different with the color scheme to kind of explore a similar composition and a similar idea, but to add something new and fresh to it. And for the description of this guy, I made something up about how the bright colors make the skin and the plant life, so like the dried rose petals, blend into one living being or something. My image 8 was an artist study of this artist who I really enjoy. I've been following her since like early 10th grade. Her name is Jasmine Chan, and I just explored how I like their use of the color red, how I like their very precise line work, how the flowers convey the sense of motion, even though like flowers are inanimate objects. And I talked about how the style remains very consistent throughout tattoo, ink, printmaking, all these different mediums. How there's this very careful balance between light and dark and the shapes of different objects, like is it blocky, is it thin and slender? Because I really like their art and I just wanted to see, you know, why do I like it so much? And then I took all that information and I drew off of it in this next piece. Now, it's very clearly my style. Like, my intention was not to copy Jasmine, but just to incorporate what I liked about her style in the tattoo here. Clearly, I used a toned tan paper for this, but I still added some, like, brown shadow detailing to convey the wall. And I talked about how the toned tan paper is like actually left blank here, so like I didn't color any of the skin in, I only colored the outside parts, and so this figure's body is like a blank canvas to put art on, which can be seen through these like black ink tattoos that slowly morph into real flowers. Next up, I have another painting. I really like this piece. I don't know why. Like, something about the composition isn't perfect, but still the colors going on are really like juicy. For this piece, I first did a red underpainting, so like this entire thing and the hands too were just red, and then I added the other colors on top. But since there is red underneath it, it kind of gives the whole thing like an eerie, glowing feel. And you know, me being me, couldn't do a sustained investigation about plants without involving mushrooms of some sort. So we've got like Chinese hot pot type of mushrooms here, and then here we have like mushrooms from popular culture. The Mario mushroom, what is his name? Murakami? The concept was just kind of like, oh, different people sharing meal, but different people have different perceptions of what mushrooms mean based on their like background and knowledge in popular culture, or what culture and traditions they come from. Honestly, I'm really proud of how the hands came out on this one, and they took like 45 minutes each. My 11th slide was again a sketchbook thing. This time there wasn't much to do with like the medium, I just wanted to explore different compositions of the same concept. So on the upper left, I was just like, oh, person surrounded by plants, and it didn't look very good. It was like too symmetrical, and not enough focus was on the person, it was just on like the background. So then I was like, okay, what if a person is watering their plants in the sink? And I didn't really like the way the window looked when it was directly behind the person, and I also felt like this would contribute to backlighting in real life. So I was like, what if the window is on the side instead? So I put the window on the left side, but I didn't really like that. So I put the window on the right side, and that's when it clicked, because I was like, oh, so you see first the person who is on the left side of the screen, and you're like, oh, how cute, she's a plant mom, she's taking care of her plants. And then you kind of like pan across the apartment scene, and you're like, why the heck is it red outside? And then it starts to make sense why, like, the entire image is kind of reddish and got that weird eerie glow to it. And I achieved that red glowy feeling by just doing a layer of like bright red, and then I lowered the transparency of that layer to like 5%. And this was meant to symbolize how climate change's effects are very pervasive and even affect our everyday lives. So there were kind of two things going on here. It was like the climate change and then also plant moms. And this one actually holds a lot of like emotional weight for me because I live in California, and last August, so exactly a year ago, on our first week of school, the skies were just bright red outside, and it was dark because there was so much ash falling from the nearby wildfires that it was like pitch black at 3 p.m. Slide 13 is the piece I dislike the most out of all of my pieces, and it is this guy. Now this looked a lot cooler in my head, as I think a lot of art goes. It's like me here in the foreground, just me in the present day, thinking about these past memories that involve like flowers and grass. So these are like weeds, but when I was little, I thought they were the prettiest things ever, and my favorite color was yellow, and so I would pick them and like give them to my mom as gifts. And so I have that memory, and I kind of like spread them around the border as a not so cool frame because now they're dried and look ugly, but these took forever to glue on. So like these background frames, there's 2 of them. This outer one, the lighter green one with the shoes, is kind of like representing a false memory of when I was 6 years old and got my white shoes stained on the grass. That never happened. I never owned white shoes, but I just pretended like I owned white shoes and that I once got them dirty and my parents yelled at me for the sake of this, you know, AP investigation. And here's another memory that actually did happen, where it was just like me and some other dude from elementary school sitting on the grass and like chatting about life. It was meant to be this really cool, like, you have nostalgia based on the smells of plants, because these flowers, these weeds do have a distinct smell. But I don't know, the overall execution I don't really dig. Like, this is clearly way too dark, it's way too black. And I think the watercolor had a nice concept behind it of like, oh, the memories fade away as you get older, and all that remains is like the tangible flower that makes you remember the smell and reminisce on your past. Like, the idea was cool, I just didn't do a good job with it at all. Next, yet another sketchbook page. I didn't realize how many I did in here, but it was just like exploring paint markers. I got some really cheap paint markers from Target, and I just wanted to see, like, do they blend well? Do they layer well? And the fact is that they are opaque because they are paint markers, so you can put light colors over dark colors. I thought that was cool. I tested how long between like putting the paint on the paper and smudging it with your finger would make it smudge or not smudge. And then I applied all of that in my next piece. All of this green in the background is acrylic paint. I painted the squares like pretty haphazardly, and then I kind of used a white paint marker to go over the lines. I used paint marker for these guys and for, I think this was like acrylic, but then I layered a paint marker on top, so you can see like little blobs of color where I used paint marker. If you're stuck on actual pieces to do for your sustained investigation, just keep in mind that you don't need to do 15 entirely fleshed out pieces. You can do like sketchbook works, maybe include an artist study in there where you look at an artist you really like, or something like the revisionist piece that I mentioned earlier but currently cannot find because my bedroom is a mess. Okay, I'm not gonna read my entire like written evidence part to you, but I just kind of summarized everything that I had said earlier in this video, and then kind of as like the finishing or like closing touch, I talked about climate change, because how can you do an investigation on humans' relationship with plants without talking about climate change? You don't have a lot of space to do like a full intro, body paragraphs, conclusion. So I feel like ending on climate change, which is like an actionable area that humans need to think more about and actually work on, is a pretty good closing to my description. Now here's the selected works part of the portfolio. Selected works is basically just like random stuff that wasn't necessarily based on your like question, so it's not related to plants anymore. This is just stuff that I pulled out of my old portfolio. I don't know if I have this one on me. It's a very, very strange size because I cut it to size. I said it was 18 by 24, but it's probably more like 14 by 24. The concept was just like, oh, I grew up in 2 different cultures, namely like Asian culture and American culture growing up in the US. Food is culture. Food is identity. Food means a lot of stuff to us, but there are 2 different, like very different clashing cultures going on, both in terms of food and like general traditions and values especially. So I talked about how I blended and like shaded colors even where the colors don't belong, and this is a technique that I kind of call color bounce. I don't know what it's officially referred to. This is a technique in digital art for sure. So like if you look closely, there's like reflected light of the green bamboo leaf on the rice onigiri looking thing, but it's not onigiri, it's like Chinese rice dumpling. Rice is not green, but the reflected light makes it green. and this kind of like makes the whole very messy, colorful color scheme a little bit more cohesive and adds some like depth to it. Also, fun fact, when I submitted this piece to colleges as like part of my art portfolio, I called it Sliced, which is a horrible name, because I literally could have called it Food for Thought, and that would have been the coolest title ever. Sometimes in life, you do things you regret. That was a joke. My next piece is this, which I called Suburban Suffocation. Everything is the same, right? The lawns are the same, the roads just like continue on forever. You can drive on miles and miles away from the city, and it's still gonna be residential neighborhoods. And I kind of tied this into like, there is no freedom of expression. Everyone thinks pretty similarly, and I'm lucky to live in the Bay Area already where it's like a little bit more liberal, but like everyone thinks the same. Everyone has similar expectations for their kids, which is, you know, like go to college, get a job, participate in the same like endless cycle of birth and death, which I kind of like symbolize through the rectangular ear and the rectangular mouth, which are like doors. And it's just very uniform. There's no feeling of growth. And this I especially felt like the emotions behind when I was making this piece in like the end of junior year, start of senior year, that I was feeling kind of trapped and suffocated, if you will, symbolized by the hand around the neck. One thing I wish I could have done a little bit better was maybe like make this part of the piece, like this corner, darker in the background, because then it wouldn't look like the hand is literally the same color as this pink and yellow blending area. But overall, I mean, I'm pretty happy with it. The colors are a bit messy with the red, pink, yellow, green, blue. Oh, I also wanted to mention, it goes from like warmer toned colors, yellow cast on the skin, to like cooler toned colors with the pink and blue on the skin. Here's another example of color bounce if you look closely. Night and day, life and death, everything is the same. Oh, life in suburbia. My third selected work, oh, what the hell, was this piece. And initially it didn't have a frame, but like my teacher mounted it. It's like a very thin canvas from Blix, and she just put it on this thing because she put it in an art show without asking me first. It's not even that good, like, I don't know why she chose it, but this was a landscape I did in junior year, and the assignment was fauvism. I think it's called fauvism. Choose a picture, but then make the colors super duper saturated, and I chose a scene of a railroad track. This is somewhere in Canada. I think it's in Whistler somewhere. So for this, I just talked about like the conflicting senses of like hope, because there's like really pretty colors, but it's also like kind of lonely, and there's a contrast between the steel and like the surrounding greenery. Oh yeah, and since this was Fauvist work, we were required to do an underpainting, so mine was a very pale shade of purple. You can kind of see some peeking through here, and I think it's very cute. My fourth work was the same, like dyeing peonies as earlier, because you are allowed to share a couple pieces between the selected works and your sustained investigation. So I just copied that one. And my final piece is kind of an asshole to show because it's just huge, and it's also graphite, and I didn't really spray it down properly, so you don't get to see it in the flesh and blood or the paper today. But this was another piece I did in Art 3 in junior year. I felt like the pencil alone wasn't like strong enough even when I went to like 8B, 10B to do the shadows. So I just used black and white colored pencils to make like highlights and super dark shadows. Anyways, that was my entire AP art portfolio. I hope this video was helpful and gave you a couple ideas on what to do. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye. Also, our art teacher told us she watches these occasionally, so Miss C, if you're watching this,